So I just saw Dark Phoenix, and I have to say that my expectations were pretty low going in. And I had seen one clip about a week or two ago that kind of prejudiced me pretty significantly about this movie beforehand. So my expectations were basically on the floor coming into this film, but I was willing to go see it and give it a shot. Um, but what you see here from me in terms of my relating my experience with it uh, is due to that influence of the previous clips and some of the information that I found out about this film as it was in development. So, anyways, I thought it was a little bit better than critics' scores, and they're pretty low right now. But I also thought this movie was just about average within the franchise if you look at all the films total, because there's been some fairly bad ones in this one. And although it may be a little bit below average, but I don't think it's terrible per se. I did enjoy some of it, but I do felt like it started to unravel a little bit as it went on, as certain developments occurred that I thought were kind of an insult to the franchise. And I don't think it's really a fitting end to this 20-year experience that we've had since the very first one came out in like 2000, 2001, whenever it was. I do think the combat scenes in this film, many of them were actually straight out of the comics to some extent. For example, how do you get someone that can shoot lightning out of her hands to fight someone with, say, a different set of powers entirely, when realistically one person could kill the other person if they just strike first. Yet these characters are somewhat powered down to some extent in terms of the way they fight, and it basically gives each of them a chance to sort of do something. Like when someone with laser eyes shoots, someone with other powers, this sort of combat doesn't immediately end in like 3 seconds. So I thought they did really good. And that was sort of a good tribute, relatively speaking, with the comics. Though it was a little hard to see some of the details in some of the scenes, particularly the night scenes. Basically, I thought there was some great X-Men versus X-Men comic, all things considered. But one of the things that disappointed me as I watched this film is, I saw the trailers and it looked like Emma Frost, the White Queen, was maybe going to be in this one because the actress that plays her and the way that she's all white, basically, her hair and everything. And this person was basically not it. And I won't spoil it here in this half of this video. But basically, I thought what I was going to see was essentially, the Hellfire Club or the Hellions, Emma Frost and other people, Sebastian Shaw and others. And unfortunately, that was not going to happen in this film. I really thought they could have honored the canon from the comics better, and it seems like they didn't really do that in this film. I did like Nightcrawler, for example. If you notice from the trailers, he's in this film. I thought the actor that played him and what he was given, the moments that he was on screen, I thought was really good. But not every character shined as much as Nightcrawler did. Also, the story was a little disjointed, and you could kind of tell, in that second to third act that things were not going well. It was not good storytelling. I'll just say that. Even though I thought the actors tried to do what they could with the characters that they play, but the story was just disjointed, and there's no way to lightly say say that. Also, the continuity was out of place in terms of the overall canon of the film franchise. So that was kind of a mark against it as well. Also, if you see this film, don't stick around for the anything after the movie. There's no mid-credits, there's no end-credits scenes or anything like that. Oh, I do think the special effects were really good for the most part, particularly the stuff that happened in some of the stuff in space I thought were pretty good. Some of the Dark Phoenix effects were pretty good, but some of the combat effects like X-Men versus X-Men weren't as high quality, and you could somewhat tell that certain combat scenes were relatively lower quality compared to others like in space, etc. Everything involving the cosmic level powers I thought was relatively good, just me personally. I thought the acting was good with most of the main stars you expect in this current class. I guess this would be the second class within the franchise. But I just think that many of them were not written well. For example, I'll just mention Mystique. I thought was not written very well. I thought that she had relatively limited time on screen, unfortunately, and I think that could have potentially affected the actress's role in portraying her. And there's some critiques I have that I'll put in the spoiler section for that. But the big problem with this movie is that it basically suffers from a condition that is replete within this X-Men series, which is why I have a hard time putting it at the bottom of all the movies within the X-Men series, because the issues within this movie are fairly common with the entire series. Anyone that's a fan of the X-Men, either from the comics or even the animated series, or even a fan of this movie series, the way it started in the first few movies, this movie is all over the map, and it's because the people that are essentially in charge of putting it together and writing an overall story that fits together, and with all the different scenes that come together and what happens with the characters in the film and how it relates to other films, it's all gone. None of that is happening in this film, and it sort of betrays what you would expect to happen in this film, even if it's essentially new territory. For some, it's just not honoring the rest of the franchise, and so that's why I think it suffers, and why it's basically average to below average in my opinion. Clearly, there are people involved who understand enough about the X-Men franchise and many of the characters, because you can see elements of good things throughout this film, but there's not enough of that in the right places to put together an entire story that fits with the rest of the universe. It's similar to Star Wars Episodes 7 and 8 being written by people who want to create stories that essentially play lip service to the franchise, but they want to make all new stuff for the sake of making new stuff. It's like being a rebel without a cause, essentially. Instead of bringing the series up and expanding it and honoring previous material and tying it together with future material, even material that's been sort of retconned out, like it doesn't pay heed to the rest of the series, and it's obvious as you're seeing this film, you're doing like this from time to time. And keep in mind, I somewhat enjoyed this film, and I'm still making this critiques because I think it could have been so much better considering what they wanted to do with this story. I just think they fell short. I just feel like this is not an additive movie. It doesn't add to the series, it's subtractive, because it takes things away that occurred in other parts of the films in order to make what happens in this film occur. And that's not good storytelling. The story has to be contiguous with everything else. And anyone that reads comics knows that, 12 issues later, what you're dealing with here may reference to something that happened in the past, but there's generally speaking a continuity. And that's just not something that happened well in this film. And what brought them here to this point was not being regarded, and they made a lot of it irrelevant. And the stuff that precedes future in the timeline is also largely irrelevant. So that's something that I didn't like out of this film. So now I'm going to talk about some of the spoilers. For example, one of my big critiques was, there's always been the Professor X versus Magneto conflict. And there's been a Mystique versus Professor X conflict as well, and they each have their own somewhat similar reasons within the comics that you would like to see come to life in this film, and they don't do that. So basically what we saw here was not believable. The typical conflicts between Professor X and Magneto and Mystique, etc., are usually over methods for dealing with the human mutant crisis and how to teach and raise their students and their proteges, etc. And her excuse for having a beef with Professor X was essentially that he was too egotistical and loved the attention. That is not consistent with the comics. You can certainly make the argument that the X for Professor X is X-Men, although there's other, like the X Factor and other X genetic type of stuff that matters within the the canon, the reason why these people, why the team is named this way. But it's not a male ego kind of thing. And Professor X being egotistical was not why he formed the X-Men, and not why he had the overall strategy of essentially keeping everyone hidden for as long as possible and try to save the day essentially without too much attention. And then over time, as they get notoriety, they want to be heroes and not villains. And I thought that Professor X essentially made the better case at refuting these charges by Mystique, and I just thought her complaint was not believable. Also found it, on the other end, hard to believe that the X-Men were so buddy-buddy with the government and they're doing all these missions for them, and halfway through the story, because of the actions of one now evil mutant, the government completely changes their stance, and these superheroes are all potential supervillains, and we now have to change and register mutants and stuff like that. And it just was not a believable thing. So also, I wasn't a fan of how out there the X-Men was, given that a few years later, in the 2001 movie that came out, X-Men are essentially all hidden, and they're in the dark, and they're wearing relatively demure leather outfits, and they're trying not to be hidden, and no one really knows where mutants are. And so this sort of is an example of where the continuity of the existing universe is kind of thrown out. And I thought they could have handled Mystique's death better in this film. Maybe she regenerates and didn't fully die. There's ways you can sort of touch that. Maybe a mid or end credit scene would have touched on that, for example. But I find it hard to believe they're just going to completely kill off Mystique in this series, even though I know it's not going to continue because because Disney essentially bought Fox, and they are now own the content and all that kind of stuff. But the way this franchise could have ended could have been so much better. Just killing off a significant and a good and interesting character with a charismatic actress the way they did. I just thought that her death was not good, and I think it was obvious in the way the film progressed that it just wasn't good. Sure, it was a necessary plot point, but it was just, I just thought it wasn't handled well, and I thought they could have come up with better plot points and better reasons to create conflict in order for all this story to carry forward without necessarily killing off Mystique per se. I just thought that was done. And I think that this is very similar to how the Marvel Cinematic Universe killed a handful of characters they shouldn't have killed. I thought were killed badly. I thought they basically killed off Mystique badly and prematurely in this film, and I thought that was not good. And I think that prevented her from having more interplays with Jean Grey throughout the series. And I just thought that her beef with Professor X was bad as well. So there are a lot of things written with these characters that did not make sense. That I don't know how the actors could have processed these as being a good thing. And I'm tired of comic book movies putting people in place to make these films, and they're essentially bad at making these stories, etc. Just for example, in the comic books, Beast was an X-Men for the longest time, and then he went over to the Avengers. And here in this film, they could have had a scene where essentially Beast walks off and does his own thing, leading to him being able to join the Avengers. Even if they don't even hint or reflect that here, him leaving points to that being an obvious kind of thing. But these people don't know what they're doing, and they basically reaffirm him as being more important within the franchise, and so he's now required. So I'm not sure how the series is going to be how this franchise is going to be re-innovated into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but I thought that this franchise was not done well in this final film. I'm also not sure why there's a Jean Grey school or why Xavier retired, because within this aspect of what this franchise is trying to echo certain things that happened along what happened with the comic books around the time that they were created in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, 2000s, etc. And they sort of throw all that away. So I don't know why there's a Jean Grey school in the early 90s or why Xavier is retiring there, because in the comic books that didn't happen there. So anyways, also the film, as I mentioned, doesn't lead up to the first three X-Men movies very well. Even if some of the third film was retconned out of existence, thankfully so, all that is basically to the wayside based on what we see in this movie here. I will point out, I'm going to digress from this because I could go on forever, and that's not what this video is supposed to be about. I thought the train scene was one of the best scenes in the film. You finally get to see a lot of the characters do what you want to see them to do that they didn't quite effectively do up until that combat scene in New York or Manhattan or whatever it was, leading up to Magneto and Professor X confronting Jean Grey. That first combat scene was good, very comic book honoring, but not what we saw in the train, which is what we really got to see in the X-Men comics once these characters really started to show their powers. One of my criticisms of this film is that the aliens that essentially were the bad guys in this film, not the Hellions or the Hellfire Club or other mutants or anything else like that, I didn't really understand them, and they all had Deus Ex Machina powers that essentially allowed them to do all the things they needed to do to advance the scenes. They had superhuman strength, practical invulnerability, they can heal really fast, and they can do like telekinesis, and they can fly, and they can be in tunnels, and they can do all this stuff, and they just were way too powerful. And that one chick basically can absorb all the Dark Phoenix powers from Jean Grey, and it just seemed too much that kind of powers that just fits in and that does everything that I didn't enjoy. I thought that made these aliens too super powered, and they're, I don't know, like an assembly line of NPCs with a set of godlike powers that allow them to be the threats that they needed to be in this film. They're not too overpowered, they can be killed, but man, I just thought that they were too nondescript. There's no backstory for them really, other than what was narrated. You didn't get to see them. You didn't get to understand. They were basically emotionless. They didn't have feelings, and it was just hard to really get a handle on the aliens. I didn't like them. I didn't think they were an effective enemy, and I thought they were below standard fare for even comic book villains that make it to screen. They're basically the Paste Pot Pete villains that are somewhat overpowered, and I just didn't like them. One nitpick I had was I didn't understand why Mystique wore her human guise when she did. Normally in the comic books and in the movies, when she's around humans, she wore her human guise essentially to hide being a mutant or to not give people shock. But she would just, hey, I'm just going to talk with Professor X and I'm going to unwind with a human exterior. Like, I don't understand why she would. I don't understand what the plot or the character-driven experience that led to her to do stuff like that. Not a big deal. It's a nitpick. I'm falling under the nitpicks for the finishing up this review. Also, I didn't understand what was that field in the middle of like Alabama or Oklahoma or something that Magneto and his tribe of merry men are doing. Like, what's that supposed to represent? Is that Genosha? That just looks like hillbilly country out in the fields. Nothing against hillbillies. I'm a redneck myself. I'm just letting you know that just didn't seem like a significant place. It's just a little tribe of a handful of mutants, basically. So I don't know, little village. Anyways, I will conclude with this: the movie didn't tie the series together. The X-Men are basically unknown in 2001 with the first X-Men movie, and here they're superheroes for the past 3 previous decades, and a lot of the elements that really don't make sense emanate from that, as well as what various characters did that were sort of out of context. I still enjoyed the movie, but I think part of that because my expectations were on the very floor coming in. But I think overall it was decent, but it didn't end the series well. It had bad continuity with everything, and I think some of the decisions made were bad, like killing off Mystique and making the aliens the enemy, as nondescript as they were. And I thought Jessica Chastain would have been Emma Stone, and I was really disappointed with that. So I would give it basically a C minus, but it basically suffers some of the same affliction that a lot of the other X-Men films did, is that it doesn't honor the rest of the franchise that well in many cases. In some cases, certainly, like Apocalypse, for example. And I just think that it was not as good as I would have liked. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.